All right, so welcome everyone. I think we'll get started, and as those folks continue to join us, that's great. So welcome to the session. You've made it to Friday of TD week if you've been with us for the whole week, and so congratulations on making it to Friday morning. And we've got two more great sessions today. This one with Lauren and I on teaching in lab-based environments, and a session this afternoon from PSAC, the TA and RA and TF union. So for the session today, we're going to start by talking about 4 key questions for TAing in lab settings. From these questions, we're going to propose some strategies and some ideas. And part of that is what you might do at the beginning, during, ending, and after a lab session. And these are strategies for teaching in all different types of lab environments. And then we're hoping to leave lots of time at the end for some questions and some discussion.
And I think it's also valuable to note that Karalyn and I have direct experience in the lab, but from the perspective of the anatomical sciences. We were both TAs in that environment. We were engaging in our master's studies. Karalyn, you've had experiences in biology and some of the other departments. So we're coming from that perspective, though I think what we're presenting is much more broad and much more generalized than our personal experiences. And that's why I think we pose these questions to you first.
So the questions that we'd like you to consider, and you can feel free to write in the chat if you would like to share with everyone, is what will your lab TA role look like this year, if you know already, if you have a TA-ship in this upcoming year, and what makes you most excited about that lab TA role?
You can share the chat and also feel free to unmute and contribute verbally. I'm especially curious if there's anyone out there who knows they're TAing in a lab, but that experience might be happening in a different way. I assume that for the most part, given news that has lately come through as to what our term will look like, that most, if not all, labs will be back face-to-face. Though I know in this past year, there have been labs that were facilitated in a remote sense, in a very different kind of laboratory experience.
Hi, I think I can start. So I am a program associate and we are running labs, and we have like a couple of TAs to assist us in different capacities, like prep TA, lab TA, grading TAs. Mm-hmm. But as you just mentioned, like some TAs are raising concerns about attending in-person full capacity, and there may be accommodation issues. I'm just wondering how that can be handled. I know there may not be an answer, but if someone is saying like, I don't want to go in person, and then.
Yeah, I think you bring forward a good question, Baharul, and I think that I don't know if I have a great answer for that question right now. At the moment, I know I've heard every faculty and department is working with their TAs in different ways on how to get back to campus and how to get back to kind of in-person sessions. And I think that that's going to be really specific to the needs of individual graduate students who are working as TAs, and finding different ways that grad students can contribute in that TA role. There are so many aspects of a TA role that might not necessarily involve in-person instruction. So a lot of TAs who might not be physically present in Kingston or on campus might have roles in marking or communicating with students in different ways. So I think that it's going to be about getting creative in how students participate in that TA capacity. All right, so we're going to jump into some 4 key questions that we think are important for teaching assistants teaching in lab settings. And so Lauren's going to start us off.
Yeah, and I really hope that these key questions feel applicable no matter what. As you've highlighted through that previous conversation, there might be some variability or there might be some unknowns, though I think these 4 questions actually might help you in addressing or navigating some of those unknowns. And so, as Karalyn just mentioned, one of the first important question we highlighted is, what is my role? And seeking the clarification that you need from the instructional team, whether that be, you with other TAs, you with the laboratory coordinators, with the instructors of the course, to ask questions first off as to what is the nature of your role. So who will do what tasks. For example, who will introduce the lab, because that's a particular role that some TAs will serve, though not all. And who will facilitate the lab component, and maybe how. So those are really tangible, instrumental questions about the what, who is doing what. But then there may be other questions related to role in terms of what your role will be in supporting students. So the third bullet there is, when should I answer questions and when should I encourage students to think through the answers themselves? And I think what this question is kind of getting at is, what is my position or my role in facilitating learning, and how do I navigate some of the decisions about when I step in versus when I step back and encourage students to be taking a different approach than seeking me for the answers, because that's a really important balance to strike as a TA in the lab. And then the final question on this slide is targeted at some clarity around assessment and if your role is related to grading students' work or not, because sometimes TAs will be generalists. They will do lots of different things related to labs. Other times, different members of the TA team will serve different roles, like Karalyn mentioned, where one particular person might be, or a couple of people will be identified as graders. So if you have a grading responsibility as part of your role, becoming familiar with the elements of the assignment, if there's a rubric, if there are certain policies that influence your engagement in that grading, will be important to understand. And I was reflecting on this question. I thought it's also maybe important to go through, say, the lab report that students are expected, or what the assignment, the submission is, and clarify what the range of appropriate answers might be. I know some labs where you're looking for a very specific number or a very specific answer in which there is not going to be any variability. It's that yes or right, or yes or no response, as opposed to other questions where it will be acceptable to see a range of responses, and that there might be multiple correct answers to that question. So really diving deeply into the schematic or the guidelines that you can seek around that grading activity. The second of 4 questions that we identified is, how can I prepare? So in educational development in the Center for Teaching and Learning, we often think of the constructive alignment triangle that sees a connection between the outcomes of learning with the activities that students are doing and the way in which they are assessed. And so a really important question to consider as you're working in the lab setting is, what is the intended outcome of that laboratory experience? And what I mean by that is, what are students supposed to get out of the lab? What are they intended to know, do, or value as a result of that lab experience? And this could be pretty varied. You imagine what the purpose of lab is in your context, because it could be critical thinking, analysis, calculation, problem solving, data collection, synthesis, hypothesizing. And while many of those might be accurate or true of the lab experience, there might be some specifics or some cases where it's actually more about identification and hands-on exploration than it is about calculating. As from anatomy, I would say that was a clear distinction for us, that we were interested in getting students exposed to the specimens in the lab, and certainly fostering some critical thinking about those, about it, and through a hands-on experience. As opposed to some of my undergrad chemistry labs, where it was very much about data collection and calculating certain elements of the chemical process to have that hypothesis and to make some interpretations. So another point here is to study the theory and content related to that specific lab experiment or experience, what you're walking through students through, how it connects to the course in a broader sense. Because that will allow you to ask questions to students in terms of, why do you think that is? You know, what you're observing or what you're seeing, how does that connect for you to the course content? And finally, if there's a procedural step-by-step lab exercise to be engaging in, we recommend going through that procedure yourself if you have the time to be able to walk through it, and anticipate where you think stumbling blocks may be, where some of the more challenging or confusing aspects are of that procedure, and in some ways anticipate where students might seek more input from you.
So the third of our questions that we pose to you as TAs to think about in the lab is, how can communication be improved? So TAs really hold this really interesting position in a course between the students and the instructor or other members of the teaching team, and are often this kind of conduit for information, whether that be from the students and what happens in the lab back to the instructor or the lab manager or whoever's coordinating that lab piece, or from that teaching team back to the students. And so I think one of the first suggestions here is to think about clarifying what the expectation is around communication and what your role is in that communication process. So here, our first bullet point talks about focusing on enabling clear communication. And I think this comes down to some of the points that we've talked about earlier of, you know, what is your role? Is it to answer questions in the lab, but also to answer questions that come in maybe through email or in OnCue? What kind of things need to be communicated in the lab? Is it also your responsibility to talk to them about due dates and deadlines for assignments that are, maybe they have a lab report due and when that's due, and understanding what else, like, are you bridging them to something else that's coming up soon? So are you talking about, hey, don't forget next week we're doing this and you need to bring this to the lab, or, understanding what needs to be communicated and when to students. Part of that role might be clarifying some of the lab policies. So this could be policies for within a lab space. So I know in the anatomy lab, we had policies around, closed-toe shoes and different dress attire. So it might be about what being in the lab space means. And it could also be clarifying policies around assignments. So where are you handing in assignments? Are they maybe giving you a lab report at the end of the session? Are they handing it into a Dropbox in OnCue? And what happens if they miss a lab or mishanding in an assignment? What's the protocol? Also, there's policies usually in each course on collaboration and plagiarism and what goes into their maybe lab work. So are they working in teams in the lab on specific elements? And are they writing team reports, or are they each writing individual reports? And making sure that that's communicated to students in a way that sets them up for success. And our last bullet point on this, and I think this is about communication, but also can be about different parts of the lab, is planning contingencies for session disruptions. I'll pause here because I see Eric's hand went up.
Sorry, Karalyn, I didn't want to cut your point off right there, but
no,
I just
okay.
want to add to the discussion on this slide. I love this point for sure. And I think that the overlying message that we see when we consider the information on this slide is, as a teaching team, a TA is part of that teaching team, and it's about synchronizing the expectations across that team so that everyone is sort of doing the same things, especially for the largest of courses, as you can imagine. So even things around safety. You know, when we talk about lab, we often think safety first. You want to try to talk about safety. And now to tie this back to what Baharul said earlier, there's going to be special considerations around laboratory safety this semester. When we talk about masking protocols, potentially some labs will ask folks to continue to social distance as much as they can. And then there'll be how the TA physically presents themselves in that space and the instructors, et cetera. So this idea of communication is really, really paramount. And in all cases, it's about synchronizing that communication as well before the messages are delivered to the students. So I appreciate this slide. It's a good one.
I think that's a great point, Eric. Thank you for speaking up and mentioning that. And I think something that actually the slide is missing that we haven't talked about here is communication between TAs on a teaching team. Because Eric, you bring up a good point about large courses. And, you know, sometimes I've been a TA in courses where we've had up to 15, 20 TAs in a large first year course. And so what does that mean about communication? And how do you synchronize what information each of your different sections might be getting, although they might have different TAs? And maybe a strategy to think about here is having an opportunity for TAs to have their own communication bubble where they can communicate with each other and saying, hey, don't forget, this is what we're mentioning in lab this week. And that can be done maybe through OnCue. You could have an OnCue forum and discussion thread that's just for TAs in a course. It could be through if there's weekly meetings with TA teams. And that's going to be something really important if your TAs are involved in marking as well and making sure that there's communication and consistency across what that expectation is when it comes to exam. Yeah, Lauren's put a great thing in the chat. There's all kinds of communication tools. You can have Teams. You can have a Teams group for all the TAs and their communication. You can have Slack. It really just depends on maybe what your course instructor, or bring some ideas to the course instructor on how you might want to communicate with the TA team. So the last point is planning for contingencies for session disruptions. And I think this is about being adaptable and just flexible in not everything's always going to go perfectly, and some things happen and that's okay. And some things are outside of our control. I've certainly been in labs where we've had a fire alarm go off, and knowing, where do we evacuate and where's the closest stairwell, and, trying to plan for things like that, but knowing that sometimes things happen when we don't expect it. I was telling Lauren this morning, one of my very first TA roles was outside of my home department. And in biology, they did a lot of work. I was in a genetics course, and there was a lot of work with fruit flies. And I had done all of the prep work, and I had prepped all my student stations. And I hadn't thought right away as students entered to tell them not to open the vials of flies. And we only had a specific number of flies and vials. And within about the first 10 minutes, there were tears happening. There was this critical situation that all of these vials had been opened and the flies were gone and we couldn't do the lab. And I was a first year master's student, and I had this panic, and really it was okay. There were other TAs TAing that I scrambled to go get some extra flies. Whoever had extra flies, I borrowed, or no, I didn't borrow because I didn't return them. I took them. But it's okay. Things will go wrong. And maybe if you can meet other TAs, if you have other TAs in your course, it's great to have contact info for other TAs to ask questions. There might be a TA who's TA that course before that would be a great resource to ask about, where is a point that might be sticky in this lab, or that I might encounter something that I'm not expecting, and ask those questions before, if you can.
And Karalyn, I think your story is so illustrative because, as you were reflecting on it, you said you don't expect the flies to disappear suddenly. Like, that's not something, and maybe this bullet point is a bit misleading in that you can't possibly plan for some of the disruptions that will ultimately happen. It's not healthy to try and think through all those permutations, but rather, as you've highlighted, the flexibility in that, and seeking out some support in problem solving as things come up, because you'll just never, you can't anticipate some of the fun you'll have in labs.
Yes, go ahead, Baharul.
Yeah, I have a quick note. I was a TA for a while during my PhD, And in one of the courses, the instructor would come and ask all the TAs to come beforehand and go through, say, for example, all the slides and tell me what you can see. So at that time, I was like, and many other TAs that are, oh, okay, ROE students or something like that. But now when I am on a different role, I realized that was so crucial because all the TAs were well informed, and when students are asking questions, they're giving the same answer, or at least like they went through material like thoroughly. So I think it also takes some time, or even TA's role is also like they have dedicated hours and then they're paid for that. So I think a decent amount of preparation is crucial. So that is my point. And then it is not just like I show up and then, okay, I know, or yeah, someone else will help. So I think, yeah, I think TAs may think or keep that in mind. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And whenever possible, having those kind of meetings with a teaching team to prepare you for what's to come in the lab, I think it is so critical. And for TAs, I know that sometimes this isn't possible based on the number of hours in a TA-ship, but figuring out what is possible and when that preparation time, whatever you're allotted, can happen with other TAs in a group. And just maybe it takes your half an hour preparation time into a much more valuable half an hour to do it with everyone.
And also it helps like in future troubleshooting. For example, some students will complain, oh, that TA said me that, or even on grading scheme, right? So if two TAs are grading the same lab, like or different section differently, then students will complain. So if all are on the same page, I have teams set up and I am discussing, but yeah, if all are on the same page, okay, so there's how we are grading, that is the answers, then there will be less like office hours and everything.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. Our fourth key question, and Eric, you had kind of predicted that this one was coming for TAs to think about, is how can we be safe? And I think our labs across all of the disciplines, whether it's in anatomy, biology, engineering, they all look very different, but there's always a component of safety associated with them. And thinking about, what are the safety and emergency protocols in the lab? And this might be something that you have in a discussion with that teaching team, whether that's the course instructor or whether there's a lab manager or lab coordinator that handles this. They would be a great resource to talk to you about safety and what that looks like in your particular lab. And it might be different for the different labs, even within your department. So if you're in chemistry and you're working with different chemicals, maybe it's a conversation about what your protocol is in a chemical spill and what different chemical spills and the reaction to that looks like. In engineering, it could be something about if a student is injured in some way with some piece of equipment, and what your process is if that happens. Something that I would advise here, and I always have tried to do, is to think about having something with me in the lab, like a small notebook, or it could be something maybe you do on a phone or a device, and have some of these critical pieces of information about lab safety with you. So for example, if there's an emergency person that you should contact if something goes wrong in the lab, having that available to you and you know where it is in case anything ever happens, because if it does happen in the moment, you might not remember, who was I supposed to call and what's the number and where do I find that information? So having some of that key safety information with you. I used to use the last page of my lab notebook just to write things like that down and just to have it handy with me in the lab. And so thinking about safety and all of those protocols that we are going to communicate to students and how we model that ourselves in the lab. So making sure that we're following the same safety protocols that we expect from students. And scan the lab environment with safety in mind. A lot of us might be TAing in labs that have been used by a different group before us. And it's important to think about, scanning right before your lab. Has someone forgotten to turn off something? Maybe there's still a Bunsen burner on from the last lab. And just to check for any hazards as you start your lab. Drawing attention to lab safety rules at the beginning and throughout the lab. What are our expectations for students? And making sure that they understand safety and that they feel okay to ask questions about safety. I think that that's something to set up an atmosphere where students feel comfortable asking questions continuously throughout the term about safety as your labs may change. And then this is a bit of a tougher question, I think, and we might have gone through this past year, but what does safety look like in online and take-home lab activities, and how is that different? And I think there's elements that are different. Students might have had at-home lab kits if you have a remote lab, but thinking about how you communicate safety expectations with students and how you still can model some of those same safety protocols even over kind of a virtual environment.
And Karalyn, as you're talking, I'm reminded of what I was saying about outcomes, because sometimes it's implicit, but other times it's actually quite explicit that the intended learning outcome of the laboratory experience is to gain some of these hands-on skills and way of thinking around safety. So whether that's online or take home or in person, emphasizing that as part of the lab experience for students, because it's important that coming into the discipline, that students learn what safety looks like and practice that. So before we continue on, we're going to make a transition here away from those 4 questions into looking through the process from start, during, and after the lab, and some considerations that might be specific to those times. Are there questions that have come up for you as we have been talking through those 4 questions, those 4 key questions that you'd like to raise at this point before we make that transition? That's okay. If not, feel free to be putting those questions or thoughts into the chat as they come out. We will head into this of looking at these different parts of the lab, if you could sort of piece them out together. And starting the lab, this slide really emphasizes that pre-lab talk, though I recognized and mentioned earlier that this might come down to a specific role that one person serves, though it can be really helpful, even if you're not the designated pre-lab presenter, to be thinking through some of these elements, because this is what maybe students, you can be thinking of as that beginning to the lab. And so, as I mentioned, the outcomes, expressing that to students and sharing with them. So verbalizing what students will be able to know or do, or even value or appreciate by the end of the lab. Reviewing previous labs and connecting. So as Karalyn mentioned, you might highlight how it connects to the overall course context, what they have been learning or where they're going into the future within the course. Outlining those key steps. And I know in the past, this has been a really difficult thing for pre-lab presenters to strike a balance of how much detail to provide up front in terms of those steps, or even in terms of some of the content that some pre-lab TAs might opt to present and provide an overview of. So really being critical, like looking at that critically and asking what's important as an overview for students, so that you actually prioritize the most amount of time to their hands-on experience while also giving them the primer at the beginning of the lab. Certainly reviewing any safety issues at that point, bringing up particular considerations for safety, and noting and inviting questions. One of the things that, I always found helpful, I always was a little bit intimidated to approach students to say, hey, you really can't come in here with that coffee. I was shy. It didn't feel entirely comfortable to me, but that is your ultimate responsibility. And it's actually easier to address as someone's coming into the lab. Like, you're going to have to go find a new pair of shoes, like a different pair of shoes, because you can't come in here with those sandals. It's easier to say that up front, as opposed to it sort of coming into your lab space and then suddenly others are looking around and thinking, oh, is it okay if I bring my coffee in here? That's where it becomes a bit of a slippery slope. I'm talking in terms of anatomy labs where the relative level of safety concern was not as high as some of the other labs. And so there was sometimes some question as to how far rules might be bended or what was going to be acceptable. So, making that explicit and bringing it to folks' attention. I see that Karalyn's addressing Lee's question in the chat there, so maybe we can continue to talk through that as we go, because I hope Karalyn's comments there address Lee's question accurately or appropriately or thoroughly. But Karalyn, maybe we should move on to during the lab. So during the lab, this is a time that you're really in that teaching position and facilitating learning. And so we recommend circulating and checking in on students. And then many of the bullet points here relate to taking an inquiry approach to your facilitation and teaching within the lab space, because this is an opportunity for students to be having the experiential hands-on learning time within the lab. Then a lot of your teaching actually has less to do with giving students the right answer, as opposed to facilitating their thinking through the process. So process questions are recommended. And what I mean by that are questions like, where are you at in this process? What have you tried so far? What steps have been challenging? What do you think you imagine will happen next? Or what do you think, like, hypothesize will happen if you do that? Circulating and checking on students, one of the best ways I've found is just to say, hey, how's it going? And to just kind of like wait to see what their responses are. And usually the response I get is, good, this is good, we're going good. And then you like start to like move away and they're like, okay, well, I actually have questions for you. So asking some follow-up questions and just being like open and there to say, hey, I'm here if you have questions. Finally, the last bullet point, if you don't know or are unsure of an answer, it's okay to say you will go find out. This was something early on in my TA-ships and my role as an instructor I really struggled with. I wanted to have the answers right there. I wanted to sound intelligent right off the bat. But I learned that actually the best, sometimes the most intelligent thing I can say is, let's figure that out together, or hold on, that's a really great question. That's a really challenging question. I'm going to go chat with some of the other TAs and see what I can learn before I respond. So, and that's sometimes the best, because you're modeling some of that learning that they are meant to do within the lab.
And I think on that note, that was one of the things that I found really helpful about having either like a small notebook or something with me during the lab that I could take notes, was for those questions that I couldn't answer. It was a spot for me to just jot down what I was supposed to go look up after the lab and who I was supposed to get back to. Just because sometimes it's hard to keep that straight if you're running a few lab sessions either in the same day or over the course of a week, and remembering those points. Sorry, my computer likes to go backwards in slides, apparently. So here we are. So you've made it through the lab and now you're ending the lab. And I think one thing to think about is keeping an eye on the time when you're with your lab. Students are often really engaged in the lab process, and sometimes they might need a reminder of when it's time to start wrapping up what they're working on and to start that cleanup process. So thinking about how you're going to end the lab, how you're going to remind them. And maybe that's also giving them a bit of a prompt of what they should be doing to wrap up and clean up. If there's something that they're supposed to hand in at the end of the session, if there is something that they're specifically, they should do for safety reasons, or to prep for if there's another lab coming in, how do they reset their station? So in maybe a post-lab talk, maybe that's part of what your lab looks like. Maybe the post-lab talk summarizes what they did in that lab today and can prompt them to start thinking about making those connections back to some of the course theory, like Lauren was mentioning earlier. What were the key takeaways? What have students maybe said that they've learned throughout the lab, or those kind of big aha moments where they figured out that piece of theory that they were struggling to understand in class. So leaving time for cleanup. And so this, I think, is important to think about what your expectations are for students to clean up their station or to finish off, and then what you might have to do as part of kind of your check and finishing up the lab. If you do a walk around the lab to make sure that everything seems to be set up the way it should be. And maybe you have a checklist for what you want to check at the end of each lab session. So this could be a quick check to make sure that everyone has turned off a piece of equipment at the end of the day, or that they haven't left out for us in the anatomy lab, it was that there was no, I did a dissection-based course, so maybe there was no scalpels lying around that students forgot to put away. So those make big safety checks. And that would be something that maybe you have a weekly checklist of what you want to check, or it's dependent on what the lab looks like that week. And then it could be something like turning off the lights, locking up any equipment, checking air, gas, steam taps, and it might be locking up the laboratory at the end of the night. And then thinking about if you've collected student work, making sure that that's something that maybe students are handing on the way out of the lab for you. And then after the lab, so the lab is over, now what do you do? And this might also be very specific on your TA role. So maybe for some TAs, that's it, and your role finishes at the end of that lab session. Or it could be that you have now other responsibilities to review some student work. So maybe you are now marking the lab reports if they've submitted something at the end of that lab session. So something to think about here is reviewing student work for common errors. So this is something that if you've noticed a lot of students did a similar mistake in a lab report, or didn't kind of make the right connection that they were supposed to in terms of that learning outcome, maybe that's something that gets bridged into a pre-lab talk for the next lab, or that you bring to the instructor and maybe that they bring up in a different way as an on-cue course announcement or as part of a lecture. And so bringing that feedback to the instructor. This is also a great chance to reflect upon the lab and other maybe things that didn't quite go as planned. So you might have planned for the procedure and had tested it out, but all your students got stuck at a particular step, and maybe was a lab manual wasn't worded exactly the way that students were interpreting it. And so that's another place that maybe there's good feedback. And maybe that's a time to reach out to your TA team and say, oh, just a heads up, students struggled with step 3 and really needed some extra guidance on that part. And so reflecting on how the lab went as well. So part of your role might be to read, evaluate, and return lab reports in a timely manner with some feedback. And I think important here is to think about if there's a rubric for this and what type of feedback students should be getting on this report. So feedback that's very specific to what they've done, feedback that's balanced and tells them what they've done really well, but also what areas they might need to improve in for future reports, and providing feedback that's actionable. So feedback that they can really take and integrate into their next assignment or lab report or what they're doing in the lab. And I think having a rubric or having some sort of marking scheme here is really important. And that's a great point to have a conversation with your instructor about what they expect in terms of feedback. And if they don't have a marking scheme, maybe that's something that you can co-create with the instructor and the other TAs in the course to help you mark consistently across TA and lab sections. And then the last point here on this slide is about routinely reflecting and seeking feedback on your lab-based teaching. So this is about self-reflection and like I mentioned already, thinking about how that lab went. Maybe there was something you couldn't clarify in your own teaching, or something that you learned that you might integrate the next time. And also checking in with TA colleagues. One thing you can do is seek feedback from your students. And this is something you can do at different points in the semester or throughout the year, is to think about asking students, hey, what's really working well in the lab? And, is there anything that we could maybe start, stop, continue, or do differently? And just kind of a quick check-in. And they might bring something to your attention that you hadn't thought of before, that you can then try out and continue in the rest of your teaching throughout the term. And there's different ways to collect feedback. Oh, Lauren, I see you. You're going to pipe in?
No, keep going. Keep going.
I was just going to say there's lots of ways to collect feedback. So you can collect it from students, but you can also collect it from your peers. You could ask someone else, like another TA in another section, if they'd be willing to give you some feedback, if they have the hours and availability to do that. And there's also folks at the CTL who are more than willing to do that. So we have graduate student educational development associates who can do classroom observations. And I think one of the fun things would be to do something like that in a lab, and to look at teaching in lab environments as well. So lots of ways to collect feedback on your teaching.
I was thinking as you were talking how a lot of this can happen formally, but there's also really great informal ways this happens. Everything you've described, checking in with the instructor, feeding forward some of the information to other TAs, getting some feedback. It could just be in those quick conversations that happen in between labs, or it could be formalized in terms of surveying students. So lots of different ways in which this can happen. And you can, facilitate that kind of dialogue.
Yeah, and everything like that can happen through either those kind of quick conversations, like you said, like maybe that's a face-to-face conversation, but they can also be things that are happening using the technology. So maybe it's asking the instructor, like if you want to get feedback from your lab group, doing a little on-cue quiz for your lab section, like, or not a quiz, a survey, to get feedback from your lab section. Or maybe that's how you're communicating with the rest of the TAs, is through kind of that Teams or on-cue communication, and letting them know what you learned in your lab that week. So now we're going to put some questions back on you all in the group today to think about. And our first prompt that we'd like you to think about is, what is one thing that you've learned today that you might try now when preparing for your lab TA role? And our second prompt is, what's something you now might maybe want to learn more about? And what is the next step you'll take to learn more about it? And it could be about anything. It could be your own development as a teacher, facilitation, what you're going to do in the lab to prepare, or something specific to your own course. And thank you, Lauren, for popping those questions into the chat. And so feel free to put your hand up, unmute your microphone, or to put some comments in the chat about what you think your next steps are and what you might try.